Okay, so we're going to look at this lecture. Although there are two chapters, there are 25 slides, so it shouldn't be a super long and arduous task. You will need this information for test 2. We are looking at larger concepts, moving away from the cellular and chemical processes, but of course all of that had to come first because it's important when you're looking at these larger concepts to remember the processes that you've learned about already, the processes behind. So you have these on your slides, terms to know, and I suppose I could stop and change that typo. Please do understand that is meant to say multi and single joint movements, not single joint movements. Okay, so first, before I begin to discuss this slide, I want to mention variability, which your book talks about and is an important concept when measuring motor performance or in many different disciplines of kinesiology. Variability is a topic I have mostly been exposed to in biomechanics. It is an interesting topic and one that does deserve consideration. The book talks about Nikolai Bernstein and his studies in the 1920s. He studied professional blacksmiths, and their job, of course, was to hit a chisel held in one hand with a hammer in the other hand. And that's what they did. And hundreds, hundreds of times a day, every day, maybe for years, maybe their entire career. So you would definitely consider them experts. Whether you consider that to be somebody who's done it for 10 years or for 10,000 hours of practice, they were pretty good at what they did. And that was the population. When they looked at their pattern of movement, they found substantial variability. They measured variability in the trajectories of both individual joints and a hammer. So the message is that humans tend to have variability in their movement patterns, and that is also found in experts. Many studies done on expert athletes confirms that variability is a part of human movement. In fact, we cannot just say too much variability is bad. There are studies showing that a certain amount might be very good, which makes sense because that's what the body does naturally. And so lots to consider there. At any rate, it is something that must be considered when looking at human movement and measuring human movement in sciences. So let's go ahead and move on with this topic of single joint movements. And this is, again, something that is mostly produced in the laboratory. We really, as I mentioned in lecture and class, even the idea of isometric movements still require some movement. It requires contraction of the muscle, technically as movement, probably some type of torque of the joint, etc. So, single joint movement studied in the laboratory, can be controlled, which is good for experiments. It is always good practice in science to begin with the simple. And as a novice researcher myself, I tend to put too many ideas into a hypothesis or a research design. It's very important to really think in terms of simplicity for an elegant design. That's going to allow you to have a lot more support for your outcome. At any rate, this again is used in clinical studies when we're talking about specific types of injuries, or if someone has a particular type of motor impairment. And also with this type of research, scientists can continue to hone their theoretical frameworks for motor control theories. We're going to be looking at task parameters and performance variables. Those are terms that you need to know, of course, fairly straightforward. So a task parameter, what is required from the subject? And then the performance variable is what the subject actually does. That's what is studied. And for a single joint movement, task parameters might include amplitude, movement time, speed, external load, and other specific instruction. Maybe they could also measure gender. They could include age. And then the performance variable, of course, you can look at position and speed and acceleration, kinematic values, as well as we can do some kinetic variables, endpoint accuracy, and that is something that you already know before you do the research. It's important to know what you're going to analyze and how you're going to analyze it before you begin. You don't just go collect data and then start figuring out what to measure. Although that sounds tempting, it's not really preferred. It's not really considered good research. All right, one of the variables that must be decided when you're doing a research project, you're maybe asking a research question that includes something with movement, is when does it start and when does it end? And the beginning can be relatively easy to define. You can pick out a moment at the start of movement or EMG burst, or you can pick a definitive time to begin. Where it ends can be a little trickier. And it has to be consistent. So it's important, again, ahead of time, to take all of the variables into consideration. Are you going to simply go by time? Or when a position trace crosses zero, maybe, for instance, the acceleration trace crosses zero for the second time, or some other measure. So each index has its own pros and cons, and it can be used as movement time. So the actual choice, particular criteria, is made by researchers based on the research question. So maybe you're getting all excited to ask your own research question. Go to grad school. Wouldn't that be exciting? All right, it is very exciting. You actually get to learn cool stuff. Okay, so your book talks about the potential infinite number of joint profiles that can accurately portray a single movement. But we do know that there are some predictable patterns in EMG signal across a range of amplitudes and velocities. We can see that for movements that are smooth and slow, there's a specific unimodal bell-shaped velocity profile and a double acceleration profile, a double peak acceleration profile. So it's pretty common. And we also can see the particular characteristics of the agonist and the antagonist. And so these are all the electrical signals that are being generated associated with that movement. This is a fairly well-known pattern, and you'll see that those bursts begin before the actual movement. So we see the electrical activity in the muscle prior to the actual movement by tens of milliseconds, several tens of milliseconds. And so take a look at this and look in your book. Your book goes through an awful lot of detail, but we won't be asking a lot of detailed questions on certain aspects of what would cause this to change. We do need to have a good appreciation for the complexity and different parameters that you yourself as a researcher could look at. This is also a great way to diagnose, in some cases, some muscular movement disorder. If a person does not have this type of pattern, then we know that there is something awry in the nervous system itself that's directing these movements. All right, so you can measure magnitude. You see they've given you some examples of EMG, peak amplitude. You could look at different time intervals. You could look at the timing of these bursts, the duration, the area underneath. There's lots of different ways you can look at this. So it just appreciating that there are a number of parameters that can be measured. All right, so when they studied movements over the same distance at different velocities, the top left is the bicep and the bottom left is the tricep. We see the angle in degrees in the top right and the velocity in degrees per second in the bottom right. You can see an increase in the rate of EMG rise, the peak value, and the area of the first agonist burst. Also, there's a decrease in the delay before the antagonist burst. And there's also an increase in the antagonist burst peak amplitude as well as area. All right, so you can see that there are some specific characteristics that are common with movements over the same distance, but just at different velocities. So the load's going to be the same. The only thing that's going to be different is the velocity. And again, this is why you control your, this is why you would perhaps want to use a single joint movement, because you could control this one thing very closely, many things very closely, so you can be sure you're measuring the thing that you want to measure, right? You're actually measuring what's your questions about. Here is an example of movements over different distances as fast as possible. So this is with instruction. So you're increasing movement amplitude without changing the external load. And the instructions are to move as fast as possible. So we see some differences. Let's take a look back here. So we certainly see some regular differences in the EMG signal. So your book says that it leads to relatively uniform rates of agonist EMG rise, a higher and longer first EMG burst with a corresponding increase in its area. Also longer delays before the antagonist bursts, and many other details. I will not ask you questions. I will not show you a graph and ask you to tell me what was changed. Okay, I want you to appreciate that every type of movement, as well as instruction, speed, load, is producing a different response from the muscles, from the nervous system controlling the muscles. It's quite complex. And then this last one is changing the load itself. And so we see that this is also giving a difference. Taking a look back here, quite a difference, right? Quite a difference in what we're observing here. So be aware of these differences. Changing the load, by the way, according to your book, leads to greater and longer agonist EMG activity without obvious changes in the rate of the EMG rise, a longer delay before the antagonist burst, and no apparent changes in the antagonist burst characteristics. So many differences between these three just by controlling for one parameter. All right. How about the dual strategy hypothesis for you? That will be very exciting. All right. Let's see. Another motor control hypothesis. When we are measuring EMG, keep in mind what we are measuring. Of course, it's easy to remember that we're measuring electrical impulses in muscle tissue, but where does that originate from? What controls it and directs it? So some hypotheses of motor control assume that EMG is a reliable measurement of control signals from the central nervous system. So that's assumed, and it reflects processes of voluntary motor control. But some other hypotheses of motor control assume that EMGs are generated with equally important contributions from central control signals and also activity in the peripheral reflex loops. So we haven't learned much about the central control signal yet. We will. That's where we're headed. But you've spent a lot of time in the peripheral system, and so you have a pretty good idea of those reflex loops, and good for you. Yay. Yay you. All right. Analysis of EMG patterns is actually a really important tool. And again, if it's something you're interested in, because I know that you're all very excited about this material, you might want to learn MATLAB and be able to analyze EMG data. Come on. It's kind of fun. People look at you like you're crazy. All right. One of the most developed hypotheses within the first group back now to the measurement, a reliable measurement of the central nervous system, so more of the voluntary control group, is this dual strategy hypothesis. All right, so this hypothesis assumes that the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system are partners. In this case, the nervous system sends general pulses to the motor neuron pools. And depending on the variations of these pulses, the motor neuron pools act as filters. They filter out the information. A low-pass filter is actually going to filter out higher frequencies. It's kind of the opposite. It's opposite day when we're talking about filters like that. So in this case, again, they're talking about these motor neuron pools acting as filters and selecting some movement based on their parameters and then responding. They talk about two strategies at this level, one responding to speed and coding for movement duration, and one not. A person can perform movements at the same speed or at different speeds. Movements performed at the same speed are controlled by the speed insensitive strategy. Movements performed at different speeds are controlled by speed sensitive strategy. There you have it. The dual strategy hypothesis implies not the actual movement speed, but an internal variable that the brain uses to vary movement speed. I know. What else do these people have to do besides sit around and think this up? All right, so an example we're given: if a subject is asked to perform the movements as fast as possible, he or she will probably use the highest available value of this internal variable. The actual speed, however, may be very different if, for example, movements are made against a load. So we may be operating with a speed-sensitive strategy and changing our speed to the highest level. And we may, however, not be moving very much if we are working against a very heavy load. The signal is what is considered, not the actual speed of movement. And as quickly as we introduce it, we are going to now discount it. Yay! All right. Originally, our book tells us this dual strategy hypothesis, it was based on the idea that we control movements by sending commands directly to the alpha motor neurons and to both the agonist and antagonist muscles. And that is what we see in EMG readings. But unfortunately, the alpha motor neurons also receive peripheral information. So not only do we receive descending information, you have learned that we receive information from the receptors, and that's going to change the activity level as well. So that discounts the idea of a direct control from descending order. All right, so we're being asked to imagine that a person is using the same brain signal to control two movements. But during the second movement, the load unexpectedly increases by 4 times. So we've gone from 20 pounds to 80 pounds. The movement speed will drop, and the drop in movement speed will be reflected in the activity levels of virtually all of the peripheral receptors. And so that is that reflex effect of the receptors on the alpha motor neurons change, and that changes the EMG patterns. Because we are looking at the actual movement, so we're looking at the activity directed by those alpha motor neurons. So if the reflex effect changes the patterns, the information coming from the receptors on the alpha motor neurons, well, then we're not going to see the EMG. So we can't say that EMG patterns are reliable of only central control signals. Correct? Right. So they tell us that the problems with this dual strategy hypothesis, EMGs are, there it is, what I just said, consequences of both. If a movement is perturbed, then we do see a change in EMG. Of course, anything coming from the central command are going to have a longer time, to travel. So that should come later, and we don't see that. It happens, and we are fairly well-defined responses from the peripheral receptors. So telling us to a large extent, early changes in the EMG signal are defined by changes in the muscle length. So what controls that? What is setting the muscle length? Those pesky muscle spindles. That's right, and the gamma motor neurons working with the alpha motor neurons. All right, let's see. Moving on, chapter 12, pre-programmed reactions. You may have seen this information before. I know Dr. Wolf teaches this in motor learning. So let's take a look, see what you remember, see what we can find. So during normal movement outside of the laboratory, it is expected there will be disruptions in the planned management or perturbations. Sometimes our endpoint changes. Sometimes an object in the environment interferes with our planned movement. And sometimes something internal shifts. Or maybe the system is not healthy. Maybe there's a joint issue, or the system itself is not functioning optimally. The health is compromised. So the body still has to compensate for perturbations, whether they be internal or external. And that is the magnificence of human movement. The human body is very well equipped with a variety of mechanisms for us to sustain stability. Falling is very dangerous for us. Our body is very good at not falling. We are not designed to fall well. We are not like a round, short thing. So, our bodies are designed to keep us upright and correct perturbations. So something that we can measure and look at and study in different subfields in kinesiology. So you may have learned about these with different terminology. We're going to take a look at these reaction times. So the book has a long list: latency reflexes, pre-programmed reactions, functional stretch reflexes, M2, M3, and all of these are and sometimes called triggered reactions. At UNLV, it's often considered M1, M2, M3, but we're talking about it as pre-programmed reactions. So it's basically the same thing. One of the most common procedures for eliciting a pre-programmed reaction is as follows. The subject maintains a constant position in a joint with a steady muscle contraction against an external load. For example, they're saying a load provided by a motor, which is a common piece of equipment in some motor control labs. Then the subject is instructed to return to a starting position as fast as possible in case they feel a disruption or a perturbation, which of course they do feel, and the EMG is measured. And they can see the first M1 is probably, it's a monosynaptic transmission. It happens very quickly, similar to tendon tap. It's that monosynaptic phasic stretch reflex. And then after that, then there are two different peaks, M2 and M3. Those are probably from 50 to 100 milliseconds. And after that is when we see the voluntary action occur. So we see this in, prior to the movement, which makes sense because remember, it does take a little bit of time to get all that machinery ready to go. All of those processes you learned about for the last test. Sometimes they've been called transcortical reflexes. However, that can't be accurate according to the studies where they differentiate the animals. So they're separating their brain from their spinal cord, and then their muscles still make these responses. There you have it, when they're stimulated to move. Alrighty. So one of the big differences is that pre-programmed reactions, or what we're calling pre-programmed reactions in this lecture, is different in that they strongly are dependent on the instruction to the subject. So if you repeat the experiment described earlier, but this time instruct the subject to not resist that external perturbation and to let the motor do its thing, let it move the arm, then the amplitude of the pre-programmed reaction decreases significantly and may even disappear. So just the instruction itself is actually going to change the effect. And this is different than in other types of reflexes. So there they are. Here's the list of some of what I've just mentioned. There you have it. So generate a quick crude compensation for the perturbation and then followed by a voluntary correction. So another example of what I've just discussed with you. They can't really be considered a stretch reflex because in pre-programmed reactions, the magnitude of the response does not depend on the change in muscle length. And of course, stretch reflex is all about muscle length. So depending on the instruction to the subject, pre-programmed reactions can be observed in stretched muscles and in muscles shortened by the perturbation, and even in muscles that are not changed by the perturbation. So you can think of that as a higher order function, right? So the amplitude of the pre-programmed reaction is not related to the applied perturbation. So we don't see necessarily a one-on-one relationship with the amount of the reaction in response to the amount of the perturbation if that perturbation cannot be predicted. So there's different trials, and the compensation of the perturbation can vary from 0 to 100% of overcompensation. So this fact suggests that perturbation acts like a trigger, and that trigger sets off something that's already been pre-programmed. So that reaction that's pre-programmed is triggered, and so the magnitude is already predefined. It's not in a response to the amount of the perturbation. So in this slide, they're asking us to consider that the subject has been given the instruction to maintain a joint position against a load. Then the subject it generates a voluntary command to the muscle controlling the joint, right? So then the subject's generating a voluntary command. So if the subject knows that a perturbation can occur, a corrective command can be prepared in advance. It might be triggered by an inappropriate peripheral signal. Notice that this scheme implies that a higher center, such as the cortex, prepares the pre-programmed reaction. Well, the loop of the reaction may have an effect. This slide indicates that a signal for this pre-programmed reaction can occur from any number of sensory signals. So the book describes an experiment with a grasp reflex. Places a glass on the table in front of the subject, and then the subject is instructed to place the thumb and index finger just near the glass as if she's going to grasp it. Although no command to grasp occurs, the instruction clearly implies pre-programming of the grasping movement. All right, so they've tried to get that pre-programmed reaction right there and ready to fire. So when the subject's arm is unexpectedly lifted so that the hand rises above the glass, the grasping movement is observed at a latency that is characteristic for the pre-programmed response. So in this case, perturbation has nothing to do with the length of the muscles directly involved in the grasping task. It's as if that grasp was ready to go, there was a disturbance, and the body did it anyway. So imagine these experiments are performed with different arm segments, when different arm segments are under anesthesia. So it's another way that these can be studied is by anesthetizing somebody from a peripheral nerve in one area. So it's like they don't have that. Only after the other arm is anesthetized at the shoulder are the pre-programmed reactions eliminated. So yeah, if the hand is anesthetized, the reaction is there. If the forearm is anesthetized, the reaction is still there. Only after the arm is anesthetized, jeez, that word that I was trying to say, imagine I'm saying it now, up to the shoulder, are the pre-programmed reactions eliminated. So these observations may lead to the conclusion that the afferent source of the observed reaction in the proximal segments of the limb. So it might be it's happening in the proximal, not the distal segments. So that's closer to the center, right? And in fact, information from these segments has proven to be sufficient as a signal for this reaction, but has not been proven to be necessary. So it's okay to have it, but it isn't necessary. All right. Another way to consider this is to think of changing the load unexpectedly, and then the unperturbed movement is accompanied by that traditional triphasic EMG pattern. And when the load is changed, adjustments are seen in the triphasic pattern. So what this graph does not show, however, is that the pre-programmed response typically cannot perfectly compensate for change, right? So voluntary movement would follow in order to perform the final adjustments. All right, so it is decided that the execution of any motor task is associated with these programs that can be triggered by sensory organs. Of course, we can encounter lots of changes just walking across the room. A lot of it is not something that we consider or we think about. It just happens automatically. I have 2 cats, as some of you know. When I'm walking down the stairs, I have a little girl cat who loves to throw herself on her back on the next step that I'm about to land on. And I've learned over the years, first to not pet her, because we don't want to give her, a reward for this behavior. But also that I have to be ready to move because there is a cat with her belly up and we would both die. So there you have it. I have an external perturbation ready to happen. I'm sure I have developed a pre-programmed reaction that is probably being activated at proximal area of my lower limb. There you have it. All right. Pre-programmed reactions depend an awful lot on the instructions given, so this also makes it quite different. And so they do occur when instructed to compensate, and they don't when they're told to ignore it. So that's quite different. They don't depend on resting muscle length. There's no correlation between the perturbation and the amplitude of correction. And by the way, they're unchanged by or during, forget the by, during vibration. There it is. So we always have to bring vibration into it, something that we can do in the laboratory. You know, crazy scientists, what else can we do? Let's vibrate the muscle. They're nutty. All right, so we see here that M1, which is likely the reflexive response, is suppressed. But M2 and M3 are unchanged. So remember, M1 is likely that reflex, and we looked at vibration previously, so we do see that vibration can suppress those monosynaptic reflexes. All right, so again, as I mentioned, it's really important for us to stay upright. You know, particularly as we get older, but you know, you've heard of, oh, grandma fell and broke her hip, which is often more of an indication of osteopenia or osteoporosis and a fall. But that in many, many cases is actually fatal, which sounds crazy as a young person, right? To think that falling could be fatal. But it's actually not good for our bodies, right? We're not supposed to fall. We are intended to stay upright. So we do have pre-programmed reactions that allow us to stay upright, and that can be measured in a variety of ways. Postural balance is a very complex activity. EMG responses differ depending on what the task is. The goal of the task and any variety of perturbations that can occur. So in this example, they're talking about EMG readings on the arm, and they're different depending on the temperature of the liquid in the cup. If the liquid in the cup is very hot, there's more activity found in the arm muscles. Well, this makes sense, right? We're holding it in a different way. We can also measure, standing there probably on a force platform. So there's different measurements that can be made on a force platform. We always do move just a little bit, by the way. You know, we always have a little bit of sway. It's normal, and that can be measured in different analysis in MATLAB. Another good reason for you to go learn MATLAB. So we see that we also have a corrective stumbling reaction. I had intended to show you a clip from Ellen DeGeneres here. Maybe I'll post it on Web Campus for you. She does a funny bit about corrective stumbling reactions. Very old stand-up of hers. All right, so locomotion is very complex, and it is studied quite a lot in biomechanics, but it's something that we do all the time. It's something that can be also analyzed in physical therapy for different issues in motor control. It certainly is something that is studied in diseased patients, particularly in Parkinson's disease and any type of movement disorder. We see a tremendous amount of change in gait, and that can be very disturbing, destructive to an individual's life, ability to perform activities of daily living. So the mechanism of locomotor movement generation is considered a pre-programmed state. During research, if a perturbation is applied at different times during locomotion, different muscles are stimulated. And we'll look at locomotion in more detail later in the semester. We did look at that cross-extensor reflex, so don't forget about that. Do take a look at that. So we see that some of these are probably based on reactions, and then of course we do have direct control as well at the motor cortex. So we do see activity, by the way, at the motor cortex during locomotion. All right. I think that's it. See ya.